Hello, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Merle Massey. I am the coordinator for undergraduate research here at the University of Saskatchewan, and this is the first of our Summer SURE 2022 sessions for those students who are part of our SURE Student Undergraduate Research Experience program here at the University of Saskatchewan. If you're joining us from elsewhere or you're joining us from sometime in the future, this is still one of the most fundamental sessions that we host for SURE. Every academic needs to do this at some point in their university journey. And with us, we have Angie Gerrard from the University of Saskatchewan Library. And with that, Angie, I'm going to turn it over to you for comprehensive searching for your literature review.
Great. Good morning, everybody. It is a Monday morning, and I realize on my slide it says May 5th, and it's actually May 9th. And so I'm not sure if that's what's going on there. So I apologize for that, but it is in fact May 5th. As Merle mentioned, my name is Angie Gerrard, and I'm a librarian at the University Library. The University Library has many different subject librarians, or often called liaison librarians, and specifically in my role, I help support the departments and liaise with the departments of psychology and political studies, as well as social sciences in general. And the reason I bring that up is oftentimes when you're doing a comprehensive search, your liaison librarian or your subject librarian is a key partner in that journey. And so I just want you to be aware that there are librarians out there to help you. And this session is really just an overview of things to think about, like why do a literature review, how to get started, things to think about, how to keep track of things. And it's really at a kind of high level because obviously everyone's doing research in different areas. And so it's next to impossible to provide a session that's specific to obviously one specific subject area. And so with today's session, what we're going to be doing is really giving that kind of high level overview of, why do we do a literature review? What are some good strategies you can implement when you're trying to do that comprehensive search for your literature review? And where to look for different types of information, different types of evidence, and again, some productivity tips that might be helpful for you as you're, progressing through this process. One thing I did create for this presentation was, I'm calling it a research log. I'm not really sure if that's the correct term, but what it is it's a Google Doc that I created that can kind of help you through this process outside of this workshop. And so lots of times these workshops are like information. And then, 2 months later, you're like, oh, what did they say about X or Y or what have you? And so this research log is really just an attempt to provide some information about things to think about at various stages of your research or your searching process. And so the URL is there. Yes. Let me just see if I can do this here.
I'll try and find it.
Okay, I have it right here. Let's see. There, cool. Okay.
There it is. Awesome, thank you.
Okay. And can folks, I'm going to I may toggle back and forth between the slides and some links. And so if there's ever a time that you're like, oh, no, you're not on the right screen, please let me know, because that has happened in the past where I'd be talking about something and then people are like 5 minutes later saying, I don't know what you're talking about, or I can't see what you're seeing. So please, either in the chat or Merle can say, nope, we're not on the same page as you. So, that's what we need to do. Okay, and so really this is very, very brief, but oftentimes when we're talking about comprehensive searching for a literature review, sometimes we kind of get right into the nitty gritty of like, the techniques and those kinds of things. But I just really want to take a step back and talk about why do we do a literature review? Like, what is a literature review in terms of, what's the purpose of these in scholarly research? And so I want folks to look at that question. Why is a review of the literature an important part of the research process? And I'd like folks to either unmute themselves and just provide some ideas, or you can put some of your ideas in the chat. So just think for a minute about when you're thinking about a literature review, why do people do them? Like, why are they such a core component of the literature or the research process? So if folks have ideas, I'd love to hear them or read them in the chat.
Can inform you on what you know and what you don't know about what you're researching.
Absolutely, for sure. So that's that idea of kind of getting a lay of the land, so to speak. And then you're also saying, well, this is the current state of what's known about the topic, but then also what is not known, or where are those gaps? That's really important. Absolutely. Other ideas? Figuring out the holes. Absolutely. To know how other researchers conducted the research. That's right. Where it's the idea of not necessarily even just the evidence, but how they did it, the methodology. Absolutely. Defining concepts. Absolutely. Because oftentimes when you're looking at concepts, you want to know kind of what is the maybe agreed upon definitions in that particular subject area, but maybe also how others have defined it, maybe through a different lens. Absolutely. So lots of different ideas. So I appreciate that. About why do we do these literature reviews? And some of these ideas were already touched on, but oftentimes what I always think about it when I think of a metaphor, as I think about a literature review, is kind of the scholarly conversation about a particular topic, right? So it's like, what is known, unknown, what are people saying? Where's their agreement, where's their disagreement, where there's differing perspectives, debates. It's kind of giving you that story or that narrative about what's going on in that particular topic. And I think when you're writing your literature review, I always think of you as the researcher having a role in terms of making those connections, right? That's kind of your job in the scholarly conversation, or your contribution, where you're looking at, okay, I'm looking at all these major works. What are the connections? What do you have to say kind of about the state of the literature? And that's really what forms a literature review. And oftentimes it is also a way of just, pointing people ways forward, new ways of thinking about things. So really, when you think about a literature review, it's important then to do a comprehensive search, right? So you can kind of address, what is the state of the literature? And you can say it confidently because you have done that comprehensive search, right? And so you can't say, well, I searched for 5 minutes. This is what the literature is telling me. Here's my literature review, and so on. So it's that idea of comprehensiveness that is important to some degree. And the reason I say that to some degree, that little caveat, is that there's lots of different types of literature reviews. And I think this kind of continuum or chart that I have here is a way of kind of saying that there isn't one type of literature review, and you'll probably, you either may already be familiar with this or seen this in different contexts. And so kind of the different points on this continuum talk about how comprehensive or not a literature review is. And also, is it a standalone piece of work, or is it a part of a larger piece of work? And so, for instance, most of us are very familiar with the literature reviews that you would see in a journal article, right? And so that's usually, a page or two, setting the stage for how that particular research study kind of situates itself in the literature. And so that's a very kind of small literature review. It's part of a larger work. You also you might have been asked to do almost like a bibliography for a course assignment, where it's like, do a literature review on X topic, and it's something that you might do for a course assignment. And those are, again, just kind of selective. You're not comprehensive. You're just saying that, you're just being selective about what you're including. As you progress to the right on this chart, you'll see that the comprehensiveness is greater. And so when you are writing a master's or a PhD, thesis or dissertation, your literature review is a core component of that, and it is meant to be comprehensive. And same with the review article. You might be familiar with different review article types. So a systematic review, a scoping review, rapid review, realist reviews. These are all formalized review articles that have review methodologies and protocols and reporting standards, where you have to be very comprehensive in your searching and your reporting. So it really depends on what kind of literature review you're doing and the level of comprehensiveness. So does anyone have any questions about kind of situating yourself on that continuum? No? Okay. If you see me glancing to the right, that's where I have the chat window. So if that's where I'll be looking if there's any questions. Okay, and so this is a very, very, very generic model of steps when you're searching in the literature for your review. And so you can see it's quite, like I said, quite basic, but the idea is we'll just kind of follow this cycle throughout this workshop. So it's the idea of formulating your question, or what are you doing your research on? What's your topic? What's your research question? You're then going to develop a search strategy in terms of, well, how is the best strategic way of finding literature in that particular, to address that particular question? Where do you search? And then actually conducting the search and refining the search, and looking in different areas and different sources for in your searching, and then reading and evaluating your sources on different levels, and then writing the review. Now that sounds really easy and simplistic, and it's not. And there should be so many like little mini arrows within each of those, because it is very much a iterative and sometimes those arrows might go backwards, where you think you're done your search and then you actually have to go back and identify other places to search because there may be issues with your original search strategy. The thing that I like to, the way I like to approach this type of comprehensiveness is just kind of thinking about kind of three main kind of areas, and that's the what, the how, and the where. And so really the what is like, what are you searching for? Like, what is your topic or your research question, depending on where you are? What are the main ideas? What are some search terms, search phrases, that kind of thing that addresses your research question? The how is really the technicalities of how you're best implementing that search, regardless of where you're searching. So for instance, what are those search techniques that you're using to ensure that you're doing your search in a comprehensive and kind of smart way? And we'll talk about that in a bit. And the third part is really the where. So where are you searching? And there is no kind of golden rule in terms of, you must search in these three databases and in this and that. And, it's so dependent, obviously, on your research question, also what counts as credible evidence in your specific field or discipline, and also to what types of resources you're looking for. And so you can see on the chart here that I say like evidence or resources. It really does depend on, again, your research and your research field. And so if you're more in political studies, you'd be relying not just on journal articles, but also potentially on government reports, think tank reports, statistics, data, policy briefs, those kinds of things. If you're in the health sciences, yes, empirical research articles, but perhaps clinical trial data, other kinds of data, that kind of thing. And so you really have to think about, what counts as evidence, or what kinds of sources am I looking at? We're going to be really just, again, to try to make it as not generic, but maybe as high level as possible. We're really going to be looking specifically at how to find journal articles in this session. But I just really want you to think about that in terms of what sources am I looking at beyond kind of those peer-reviewed scholarly journal articles. And so if you're looking at that research log, if you have that open, you might want to start kind of noting, like what are those kinds of sources that I want to make sure that I'm getting that aren't just, again, those journal articles. Okay, so that first step we talked about was really the what, like what are you searching for? And so you really want to be able to formulate your ideas into a question. But as you can see in this chart here, and this is a kind of a basic chart, but you can see that oftentimes how you define your topic and your research question, you know, it's again on a continuum. And so you might be kind of at the far left where, you know what, you're just starting with your research project. It's really at a broad stage right now. You're not necessarily sure how to maybe narrow the focus. Or perhaps you're working with a faculty member who has a very, very clear research question in mind. And so you can see that through this, this model that there's, you know, you're moving left to right, but there's also a lot of kind of sub activity going on below each of those. And so if you could kind of place yourself on that continuum and thinking, you know, where exactly am I? That maybe is helpful in terms of, you know, am I just at that topic stage, or am I more at this fully refined research question? And if you are at that beginning stage of kind of getting started, perhaps you're new to this area, you're just starting, you know, your summer project, and you're just kind of getting your feet wet. There's lots of things you can do just to kind of get yourself situated in that scholarly conversation, so to speak. And really that's the idea of just giving yourself the time to explore the literature, right? And so you really want to get that kind of idea of like, you know, where am I in this literature? Like, what is the kind of the state of affairs, so to speak? You know, what are those issues? What's the key terminology? What are some potential ways I can focus this large topic to some maybe answerable research questions? And one of the things that I find is helpful, at least in my perspective, is oftentimes when so I'm sitting down with students and we're kind of at this large kind of broad topic area, is we often like draw it out. And so we often create a mind map, or what's another word for that? A concept map. And, you know, you have your idea of your kind of your general topic in the middle, and you start drawing like bubbles or trajectories, I call them, off of these. And then some of those bubbles have sub bubbles. And it's just a way of, and I should have included a picture, but oftentimes after you spend, you know, a half an hour exploring the literature, your mind map, you kind of take a step back and you realize the complexities and the connections between topics and potential ways of maybe refining your topic or narrowing your topic. And so mind maps is something that's often recommended when you're at that kind of beginning stages of your research, and you really want to kind of see, you know, what is the kind of the lay of the land with that. And another thing that you want to do at this stage, at this kind of beginning stage, is that idea of, you know, identifying those that terminology. We talked about, you know, identifying terminology. That's an important part of the kind of beginning stages of when you're starting your literature review. And the reason is that oftentimes you may have a research question or a research topic, and you may, let's say, do your search, and you're like, you know, is this everything that, you know, I think I should be retrieving on this topic? And often it's not. And the reason is that different people describe things using different terminology, right? And so there's this table that you can see on your screen there. And we in the library world, we call this a concept chart. And so what you might want to do is draft up something like this, perhaps on that research log document. But what it is, it's a way of having a written down idea, or again, concept chart of what's the terminology that you could be using to describe your research question or your research topic. And so the example I have there is, let's just say I was doing research on the effectiveness of anti-bullying programs on the self-esteem of adolescent girls. Okay, so that's more of a topic, not necessarily a research question. And what I've done here is I said, okay, you know, from that research topic, I'm identifying kind of my main ideas. And you can see I have three of them: the anti-bullying program, the self-esteem, and then the population of adolescent girls. And so what I can do then is I can start, when I'm doing my kind of background research, is I can start noting what are those phrases or concepts or synonyms that I can use to describe what I'm trying to find. And the reason is that depending on where you're searching, different people use different wording to describe the same ideas. And so you can see, for instance, the anti-bullying programs, the example I have there is the generic, anti-bullying program. But then there might be, other people might call it bullying prevention programs, or there might be names of specific programs. And so one program, for instance, is called Beyond the Hurt. And so it's just a way for you as a searcher to just start noting these things down. And from a productivity tip, or from a productivity perspective, it's always helpful to have this written down. Therefore, every time you go to a new database, or you're doing a Google Scholar search, or you're looking here or there, you're not having to reinvent the wheel. You're not saying, okay, what are some words that I can use when I'm searching? You have this concept chart. You can easily then translate it to the different places that you're searching, and you're not having to, kind of remember, what are some different wording or synonyms you can use. And so I highly recommend that perhaps on your research log, you develop a concept chart, and it can just be like, or even just, ideas, like what are some different words or concepts or synonyms or phrases that are coming up in the literature that I want to make sure that I use as search terms. Okay, is there any questions about that? No, okay. And you would have seen on the other slide that there were some ands and ors on that concept chart. And what those are, I'm not sure if folks are familiar with the term Boolean operator, but Boolean operator is that our operators, ands, ors, or not, but we typically don't use a lot of nots in our research, just because sometimes then we're throwing out research that might actually be relevant to our results or to our research. And so oftentimes we use a lot of ands and ors when we're strategically searching. And so you can see that example of or, and that's where I was looking at the idea of, I want to make sure if I'm doing my research on dementia, I'm also looking at Alzheimer's. And so I'm saying, or I want dementia or Alzheimer's. And then that's a way of broadening your search, because it's saying, I want either of those concepts. It doesn't matter. So dementia or Alzheimer's, okay? And so those would be used for synonyms, because you're saying, I want anything to do with that kind of area. But let's just say then you want to narrow your search, because you're saying, yes, I want that dementia Alzheimer's search, but I also want it combined with the idea of physical activity and cognitive performance. And that's when you use the and. And so it's a way of narrowing your search, because you're saying, all those three concepts have to be present in the results. So there has to be something about physical activity and cognitive performance and dementia. So it's a way of looking at those concepts and saying, yes, but where do they all kind of intersect? And that's the research I want to look at. Okay, and I'll show you how that looks like in practice, because I know sometimes this is a little abstract. So here's an example of a search strategy I just grabbed. And let's see, what is the research question? Does weight-bearing exercise reduce the likelihood of fractures in older women with osteoarthritis? And you can see that the way the person had done this search, and this is, I think this is a Medline search, is that they have their three ideas of exercise, osteoporosis, and bone fractures. And so what they've done is the first kind of grouping is the idea of like, what are those synonyms or ideas for exercise? And you can see they're there 1 through 6. So they searched each line of separately. And then they said, okay, we have all these ideas related to exercise. And then we want to or them, right? Because we're saying, I just want anything to do with exercise, and then these specific kinds of exercise. So search 1 or 2 or 3, and so on. And then it's the idea of, okay, now I want that search on osteoporosis. So I have that. And then my third kind of grouping is on those bone fractures. And then, so you have your 3 kind of distinct searches. And then it's like you have a drum roll and you say, okay, but now where's that overlap? What is the overlap I'm looking at? And then it really focuses your search, because it's saying, yes, out of all the exercise and osteoporosis and bone fracture, where's that sweet spot in the middle where all those ideas overlap? Okay. And then you can see the researcher or the searcher here and then said, okay, that's great. I have articles that are related to all 3 of those concepts. And what I'm doing though then is I'm applying some limiters. And so I'm saying, yes, I want all those, but they have to be with women over the age of 65, and it has to be a randomized controlled trial. So those are the different kind of limiters that different databases allow you to do. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of show you how it goes from like these ideas of these concepts to using ands and ors to applying potentially some limits. Okay, so the next kind of idea is not necessarily like we talked about kind of what are you searching, how are you searching, but it's the idea of like now where do you want to search? And again, this is really it's hard to give strong recommendations about where to search because there's so many contextual factors that one has to take into account. And so again, your research question, is it something that's very discipline specific? So are you only looking at, you know, a biological question? Are you looking at your question from a more multidisciplinary perspective? That makes a difference. What is the scope of your question? Is this something that you're looking at a comprehensive, where you're saying, you know, I'm uncovering every article that's ever been written on this topic, or is this something that I have to finish in 3 months? And so I really have to scope it. Okay, so that's another determining factor in terms of the extent of your search. And that also speaks to time frame. And time frame can be, you know, I only have a month to do this literature review, or it could be also I'm looking at research from the last 10 years, 30 years, all research. So time factor can really be dependent on you as well as the research time frame. And I've already touched on this before, but just taking a moment to think about, what types of literature or evidence am I hoping to find? And that will really define or kind of speak to the extent of where you want to search for research. So for instance, if you are looking at, like the main focus is journal articles, but you also want to look at other types of evidence and what counts as credible evidence in your field or in your discipline, that will dictate where you're going to search. And so there's lots to think about in terms of the extent of your search. And so what I would highly recommend is that once you have, you've kind of thought about this, maybe you've looked at the research log and kind of thought about maybe started completing some of it, is really, I highly recommend you reach out to your subject librarian, and they can be incredibly helpful in terms of providing you some direction. And so, for instance, oftentimes students will email me and say, this is my research question, and let's say in the area of psychology, and they'll be like, where would you recommend to be the best places to look for information? And I can help because it's based on that specific research question. And so definitely use your librarian as a point of expertise when you're kind of determining the extent of where you want to search. And oftentimes you want to consult Google Scholar, especially if you're kind of at that beginning stages that we talked about before. I always kind of, like everyone's got their own kind of research process, and I hope I'm clear, there's no right or wrong way to do research. It's a personal journey. And again, it's dictated by so many factors that there is no right or wrong way of doing it. One of my kind of methods of doing research is that I often start in Google Scholar, kind of throw the net out wide, see what's been published, and see it from a multi kind of disciplinary perspective, because that's the nice thing about Google Scholar. It's not necessarily through a specific discipline. And then I often then go to a more focused search using a database or several, and using the database features, such as limiting and that kind of thing. And then sometimes I'll kind of wrap up in Google Scholar saying, I think I've done a comprehensive search, in this more focused area, and maybe I just want to double check. And so Google Scholar is definitely a good tool to have in your kind of searching toolbox. But oftentimes folks don't know that you can set up your Google Scholar settings to ensure that you have seamless access to the library resources that we've paid for, because a lot of most of the resources that we have through the USask library. It's subscription based, and so the university pays for them. And so you want to make sure you have access to that. And so the quickest way you can do that and to provide seamless access is to set up your Google Scholar settings ahead of time. So before you start searching. And so as you can see on the screen there, there's instructions on how to do that. And what I can do, on your research log, I did include a link on how to do that. So, because I was thinking, should I include that? But no, there is a link on that research log on how to set up this, the Google Scholar settings. It's very easy. It's just a matter of searching for the University of Saskatchewan in the library links, and you save it. And then whenever you're searching through Google Scholar on the right-hand side, if the University of Saskatchewan Library has that paid access to that article or whatever you're looking at, it'll say full text of the U of S Library. You click on it and it takes you to that resource. So it's just a way of making sure that you have access to what you should have access to. Is there any questions about that? No? Okay. Do many of you already use Google Scholar in the Google Scholar settings?
I do, and I set this up and it is so helpful. It is one of the most helpful things. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And that's why I just want to make sure folks have that. And one of the interesting things is if you've done this in the past, so I would have done it in the last year and a half because I got a new laptop. So I would have set it up. And then I went back the other day and it wasn't there. And I was like, oh, are we doing something different that I don't know about? But I guess sometimes it expires. I didn't know that. And so if you might just want to check because you might be like, oh yeah, I did that. And then you look and you're like, well, we don't have access to all this. But again, you might just have to do it maybe once a year or something. I'm not exactly sure. So that was something I learned recently. So just make sure your settings or your preferences are set, and then you're good to go. And so again, depending on how you want to use Google Scholar, it is a great tool to know about. But then you probably want to transition your search to a database. And so databases are a collection of resources. Typically, they can be journal articles, and lots of times we just say journal article databases, but there are lots of different types of databases. But what we'll talk about mostly today is those journal article databases. And so the library subscribes to a lot of different databases, and some are subject specific. And so, for instance, in my area, APA Psych Info is like the psychology database. But then there's also many databases that are multidisciplinary. So something like Scopus or Web of Science. Or Academic Search Complete. Those are databases that have journal articles from across the disciplines. And so again, it's always thinking like, you know, which databases should I be searching in? And why should I be searching them? Why isn't Google or Google Scholar kind of just good enough? And again, this isn't to say Google Scholar is bad and databases are good. Absolutely not. It's just the idea of knowing kind of what you're going to be finding in each of those products. And so Google Scholar is great to get that multidisciplinary perspective, but it doesn't have a lot of features that allows you to like narrow down or limit or those kinds of things. And so databases often do provide that. And oftentimes too, you want to be looking at your particular research question through a particular disciplinary lens. And so, for instance, as I mentioned before, if I'm looking at research that's psychological, I really want to be looking in a psychological database. So beyond just Google Scholar. Okay, so that's why we want to be aware of what databases are in our area. And so when you're trying to, kind of get started in terms of, well, what would those relevant databases be, is when you start at the library homepage, which is just library.usask.ca. On the website, there is a gray toolbar, and under Get Help, there's lots of different ways of getting help. And then one of the options is research guides. And that's where you can find a research guide or a subject page for each of the main disciplines that on campus. And so, for instance, there'd be one for chemistry, biology, engineering, a lot of different ones for health sciences, all the different social sciences, and then you can navigate to your specific subject guide, and on there will be a list of what recommended databases for that particular subject area. Or even sub-subject areas. So for instance, in political studies, there's some kind of like high level databases that are relevant for political studies, but then also there's sub pages. So like, what are the best ones for Canadian government or Canadian politics? What are the best databases for international relations? What are, and so just really dig into those research guides for your subject area and see what resources have basically been curated from those, 500 plus databases. Another thing you'll find on those research guides is the librarian that's responsible for that subject area. So again, subject librarians or liaison librarians, that's where their contact information is. Often you can just email them, or there's often a schedule an appointment. And sometimes, I'll just meet with the student for an hour. We'll go through their specific research question, and we can really just kind of have that initial conversation about where those really kind of good places are to get started. When you're looking at databases, there are different types of databases. And so I'm gonna, and there's lots of different ways to kind of talk about databases. One of the ways I'll just briefly talk about is the idea of like what to search, or those like words to use. And so we kind of talk about them in terms of keyword databases or controlled vocabulary databases. And keyword databases are most similar to something like Google or Google Scholar, where you're just kind of typing in keywords and you're just seeing what's coming up. Oftentimes behind the kind of the scenes, what's happening is the database is looking at what you're searching for your keywords, and it's trying to find that in the title, the abstract, the author, kind of that basic bibliographic information. Sometimes it's looking for those words in the full text of the source, but not always. And so some examples of keyword-based databases are Academic Search Complete, Web of Science, that kind of thing. I should have noted too that often when you get to the library homepage, you're often like confronted with that main search box, and people are like, what is this? Like, should I be using this? And that's a kind of our generic search, I guess you could call it. It's called USearch. And I don't recommend it when you're doing a discipline specific search. It's almost like kind of like Google, where it's looking at all of our research across the subject areas. And if you only need a couple articles, or perhaps you're getting started and you just kind of want to see again what's the lay of the land, absolutely. But whenever it comes to looking at your topic through a specific discipline lens, I wouldn't recommend using USearch at that stage. A second type of database are ones that use a controlled vocabulary. And what that is there's a certain specific databases that use controlled vocabulary. And often it is where, for instance, in PsycInfo, what it is where there's indexers kind of behind the scenes that are assigning this controlled vocabulary, or these headings to each of the ideas of an article. And the reason they do that is that way it saves searchers time, because instead of having to type PTSD, shell shock, post-traumatic stress disorder, this, all these different synonyms, it's saying, you know what, no, this is the word we use for this particular idea. And so the reason I bring that up is that I just want you to be aware that different databases may be keyword databases. I'd say the majority of our databases are, but some may be controlled vocabulary. And you'll know when you get in there if you're like, this doesn't seem right, or this isn't a keyword database. I just want you to be aware that often when you're using a controlled vocabulary database, you're searching by subject headings. Again, that's why it's called a controlled vocabulary, because there's these predetermined subject headings that you're searching for. And that is just sometimes a little bit like takes people aback, because they're like, I don't know what this is. And so an example here is when you're looking at this device, actually, if folks could just like, if they were to look at this and say, what would I call this? I'll just give people a second to maybe put their answers in the chat box. right? So some people have said iPhone, cellular device, a cell phone. Someone might just call it a phone, right? Because it's like, who's got a landline anymore? And so that idea of that concept chart is, that's when you'd kind of start writing these down, right? Like if you were looking at an object like this, it's like, is this a mobile device? Is this a cell phone? Is this just a phone? Is this a specific type of phone? Is this an iPhone? Is this an Android? That kind of thing. And so it's just that idea of like, you know, what could people be calling this thing, right? And not like this such a foreign object, but it's just that idea of like kind of thinking outside the box about what could this be called. And it's interesting then when you go into a database, because you'll see in these controlled vocabularies what they actually call, you know, in this case, right? And so in Medline, it's called the cell phone. In ABI Inform, it's called cellular telephones. And in PsycInfo, they're called mobile phones. Okay, so it's just to give you that idea of different databases may call your concept by different terms. And so just being aware of that. And so not to like worry too much about that, but just the idea of if you are in a controlled vocabulary database, just use both, you know, keywords, controlled vocabulary. It's sometimes easier to search terms one at a time and combine them later, as we saw in that search strategy. I gave you that example of how they did one line at a time and then they combined earlier. And that idea of looking in multiple places, right? Like one database probably isn't enough, but it might be, depending on if you have to have your literature review submitted in 2 weeks. So it really there's so many factors there. Just a final thing about some tips about searching that I think are helpful when you're, again, trying to do a comprehensive search, but in a kind of a smart way. And so these are tips that I do use. And so I highly recommend looking at these and thinking about your particular research question or your topic and seeing how potentially you could use them. So for instance, truncation. This is helpful because you're not having to find, especially in a keyword database, all the different forms of a word. And so for instance, the example there of nurse is if you're looking at nurses, nursing, nurses, that kind of thing. If you truncate it after the S, you'll find all the different variant endings of that. And so if you're finding that you have a word that you can truncate, and then you're not having to find all the different, you're not having to type those in yourself, you can just truncate it. Usually it's the asterisk, but if you go into the database tips for each of the databases, it'll tell you. Wildcards is another way where it's kind of like if there's variant word endings, I don't really, or sorry, not endings, but within the word, I don't typically use this that often because there's the only time you would really do that perhaps is if there's like alternate spelling. So for instance, that color. But one I do use all the time is phrase searching, and that's where you put quotation marks around your phrases. That is something that I use all the time, especially in Google Scholar. It's just a time saver because it's telling wherever you're searching that has to stay together. That has like, so culture of safety, that's a phrase, it has to stay together. It's not culture, it's not safety, it's culture of safety. Another one that's helpful is adjacency searching. Now this is helpful, especially if you're finding that you're doing your searching and you're looking at your results and you're like, ugh, you know, these words aren't necessarily a phrase, but they have to be close to each other. And so, so you can use an adjacency operator where you can say, okay, for the example here of diabetes and health is that they have to be within one, two, three, depending on what you set it at, words, you know, they have to be close, right? And so it's not necessarily a phrase, but they have to be within close proximity to each other. Again, look at the database help tips to see if they use the adjacency word ADJ or if it's like with / the number. It really depends on where you're looking at. A final one is limits, and these limits are great. And usually I apply them at the very end of my search because I just want to make sure I've done my search well, and then I'm applying limits. So again, depending on where you search, some databases may have more fulsome limiters than others. So for instance, in a lot of the health databases or psychology databases, they'll give you options of, you know, searching by specific methodology, by certain populations, by certain, you know, age groups, you know, those kinds of things. So explore those and see what might be available for you in your particular database. And then it's that idea of, having a great search and then looking at your results and saying, oh, no, this isn't exactly what I was looking for. Like, I expected more, I expected less. Review your results. How could you refine your results? Were you expecting more? If you were expecting more, maybe you need to add some more synonyms, more ideas in terms of, okay, it didn't come up under cell phone. Maybe I need to try, mobile, or a specific type of phone, right? And so that idea of like kind of sitting back and reviewing and refining your search, that's something that is just, that's just, you have to do it because searching is very, very iterative. And so it's something that you improve on as you go, but it's something that you don't just do once and then you're done. But one of the things that I often think about is, because sometimes you're like, ugh, I only found, 2 or 3 articles, but they're really good articles, right? And I was like, that's great. That's a great starting point. And so I always call those kind of on target references, where it's like, oftentimes students will be like, this is exactly what I'm looking for, and I want more of these. And so there's a trick, or not a trick, but like, I guess these tips about how you can use those kind of core or on target articles. And I think about it almost like a web, where that's the center, and then you can find a bunch based on that. And so I call it backward linear forward searching. And so if you have one of those on target articles, you can look back into the research. And how you do that is you look at the reference list of those articles, right? And you can say, what helped shape this particular article, and maybe I can find further references from that, right? And so you're backward searching, because those would be your older articles. Another idea is looking linearly, or like across, right? Because you're saying, okay, I found this really good article in this database, and oftentimes articles will have related articles, or you like this, how about this? And so it's that idea of like, well, what are some other similar articles that are related to this? And then forward searching. And so this is where, if you have a really good article, you can type the article title in Google Scholar, and you can see underneath the reference for that Google Scholar article who has potentially cited that article. So it'll say cited by, and you can click on that and you can see who has cited it. And then it's not to say, you don't really know what they've said about that article. They may have said just a really brief citation, or maybe they've really expanded upon it, or maybe they refuted some, you don't know, but at least it gives you a way forward. So Google Scholar has that option, Scopus, Web of Science, where it's the idea of you can look at your article and see who has kind of picked it up and moving it forward. So those are some ideas you can use when you're kind of only have a handful of articles. I'm just going to quickly touch on gray literature, because I did talk about that idea of, a lot of the databases do focus on journal articles, and journal articles, scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles, are kind of the status quo for, scholarly output at the university. But there's lots of different types of evidence or resources that might also be helpful for you. And so oftentimes we kind of group these into what's called gray literature, and basically it's research or literature that's published, but not necessarily by commercial publishers. Oftentimes not peer reviewed. Oftentimes it might be something that's put up on a website and then taken down tomorrow. Like, there's just not as much control over it. And so some examples there are, think tank publications, or maybe a blog post, or maybe an association's report, or those kinds of things. And so again, it's just thinking, what are some of those resources or types of like what counts as evidence in your field, and where you would have to go to find these. And so in these examples, Google and Google Scholar would probably be the best places to find gray literature, if this is the kind of literature you're looking for, or else doing targeted searching. So for instance, if you're saying, you know what, I'm looking at a very practical issue, and I want to look at association reports related to this, I just might have to go and look at all these different associations websites and see what they're saying. So again, really dependent on what you're looking for. So in terms of kind of my 2 big productivity tips, so you're thinking about where are you searching, how are you searching, but regardless of that, just keep 2 things in mind. Is that you really want to, from the start, think about your process in terms of how are you going to keep track of everything? Because as you can see, there's lots of different kind of moving parts. And if you think about it now at the beginning of May, what is my process for keeping track of everything? It'll just help you down the road because you kind of would have a system in place. Totally can be tweaked along the way, but you have those options. And so some of the things you'll need to keep track of is that idea of just your search documentation. And so oftentimes you're sharing this with your supervisor. And so you want to be able to say, this is where I searched, this is when I searched, these are the search terms that I searched. Like, it's very much a document of, again, not reinventing the wheel every time. Another option you have is a lot of databases have, and Google Scholar with alert services, is that you can kind of set up a good search and then set it up where they'll send you information when new research is added that's based on your search strategy. So again, you can look into the databases to say, I want to save the search and rerun it, every 2 weeks and be notified. And probably one of the kind of biggest considerations is when you're dealing with all these references is a way of keeping track of them in terms of, okay, I got all this relevant research, where am I putting it all? And that's where I'd recommend using a citation manager or a reference manager. And that's just a way, it's like an online library of all your references. And it's kind of a way to export all your references to this online library that you can access anywhere. And then when you're writing your research up, you can, there's a, what would you call it? An install on Word that you can then import all these references while you're writing. It's very seamless. Anyway, there is a session on Zotero. Zotero is an open source free software. And there is a Zotero Sure workshop coming up. So if you might already be using Zotero or perhaps Mendeley or EndNote, these are all different citation managers. You will be using this summer, and then you'll be using it, for the rest of your career as a researcher. So just, again, figure out what works for you. And another thing that might be helpful is that idea of having a shared space. So if you're working on a team, you might want to, again, before you get too far into it, say, okay, where are we going to store our documents? There's nothing worse than having 5 different versions of files and like final version 3, so it's that idea of, where do we have a shared space? And OneDrive is the university's kind of online space for the university, but you might want to use something like Google Docs as well. So that's the idea of like having a system. And the second kind of, I guess, tip is that oftentimes when you're doing research, you might be prompted to pay for, let's say, a research article, and please don't ever do that. Sometimes people are like, is it $14? Is it $70? Don't ever pay. There's lots of different ways that you can get access to research, even if the university library doesn't immediately have it. One of the first things I do is often when I'm looking in Google Scholar, obviously I have my settings set up, but if I don't see that the university library has it, underneath the Google Scholar, it'll say all 15 versions, all 10 versions, whatever. You click on that and Google Scholar is looking for all the different versions of that particular article. So for instance, it might be in an institutional repository. It might be on an author's website. It just is doing that searching for you. The U of S library also has a proxy bookmarklet where you can install it. And if you're looking at something and it's like, it wants you to pay for it, you click on it and it'll again go through that proxy and say, actually, we already have full text access, here you go. But if the library does not have access and you can't find an open access version, you can always request it through interlibrary loan, and that's where we will request it for you on behalf of you from a different library. Okay, now I see that I'm running out of time, and I apologize for that. I guess there's always so much to do. I was going to do a really quick demo of Web of Science, but that's okay. I guess I just wanted to show you here that there's lots of different, again, multidisciplinary databases, subject-specific databases, databases that are beyond just journal articles. So for instance, if you're looking at newspapers, if you're looking at psychological tests, if you're looking for dissertations, and I don't expect anyone to like know all this, but it's just the idea that it's kind of understanding that it's kind of a vast landscape, and you're not expected to know that. Contact your librarian and we can help you with that. Okay, and so maybe with the time left, I will open it up for questions, but just again, remember that that log is there, just hopefully kind of help you work through some of the questions or some of the things that we talked about. But if you have more specific questions, we can talk today, and or if you think of something, in a week from now, my email address is on that research log that you can reach out to me as well. So maybe I'll just open it up for questions and see if anyone has any.
Just to let everybody know, I did put links for the related events coming up. So how to organize and analyze a literature review, and then how to write a literature review. We split the literature review into 3 separate sections: how to search, how to organize, and how to write. It just seems to work out really, really well that way, and managing references with Zotero, and I put the links in the chat. I think I need to watch this video many times. How can we have access to the recorded video? So once a video has been recorded, we upload it to our Sure YouTube channel. And so I'm going to put the link for that in the chat as well. And the best way for that is, you're welcome. And the best way for that is to go into the channel and subscribe, because then you won't miss anything. As soon as every time I upload something new, then you'll get a notification.
And just for curiosity's sake, did anyone try to access that research log? Like, I just
I
want to make
did.
sure this. Okay, good. Okay, I just want to, how you set up a Google Doc and then people say yes or no, I can't access it or something. So I just want to make sure it works. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, no, it's
so
working. It's working well. I saved it as a PDF as well.
Perfect. Okay, cool. Great. Okay. Is there any other questions that folks have?
People are popping into it left, right, and center right now. I can see people going onto it. It's a fantastic resource. Thank you so much for creating that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Again, it's just one of those things where it's hard to attend a workshop and then be like, okay, now what? So it doesn't cover everything, but maybe it helps you to think about maybe some of those key things to think about while you're going through the process. So
Estefan, that's a really good question. An environmental scan workshop. We haven't discussed doing one of those for the SURE project or for the SURE program for the summer, but that's certainly, have you been asked to do an environmental scan? Yes, then that's something that we can definitely take a look at. An environmental scan does depend a little bit on the discipline that you're looking at and the parameters of what you're looking at. We do them in my office quite often. I take a look at what other universities are doing around undergraduate research, and so and I'll compile that into an environmental scan. I might take a look and see what kind of resources I can find on the internet existing already, including in LinkedIn Learning, around environmental scans, and send that out in the meantime. How does that sound? You're welcome. Not a problem.
Can I just unmute to ask
Absolutely. Go ahead.
further follow-up?
Please.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, like I'm kind of like trying to amalgamate. I have like a business internship that's also research focused, and so I find that a lot of the workshops and the material out there are really focused to very academic based ones. And so if you have any pointers for me of just like, I'm specifically doing like a business plan portion or kind of a mix between health and business service delivery. Mm-hmm. And so I look at a lot of the stuff that is available. I'm just like, that's not really what they want me to do. So
Esteban, just so you know, we have a whole series of seminars coming up in June and July from research excellence and innovation, and they're specifically around entrepreneurship, including how to do that kind of business scan sort of thing. They gave one last summer around how to do an environmental business scan. I can send you the link to that.
Oh, please. Yes. Thank you.
Absolutely. There's a whole playlist around entrepreneurship. Whoops, sorry. I can see that I accidentally started one of them. I'm going to view full playlist. And I'm going to, oops, that's the wrong playlist. Entrepreneurship, view full playlist. and you can take a look there. So I'm going to send you the link to the playlist in the chat, and you can go take a look there, because those are the ones that came in last summer. And so the one that you're looking at is probably around market assessment, and it's one of them. And then there's a few other options in there as well. But we are having a whole series of them again this summer. So take a look on the SURE website and see there's a whole bunch just for the business, for the students who are doing the business entrepreneurship workshops with MyTax and a few related ones.
And
That's
I think
a good
that also,
question.
yeah, and I think it also speaks to that idea of like, you know, what does research or evidence look like in your field? And business is obviously a different, you know, they rely on different resources, and as opposed to some other disciplines, like engineering has their own type. And so it's that really idea of kind of thinking like what type of evidence am I looking for, and where would I go find it? So yeah, it's good to have that.
The one coming up is from Christine Peng, and I believe it's in early June 6th. I'm just putting a link into the chat as well on that. Assessing a business idea using market research. So that might be more or less exactly what you're looking for. Super. Any other questions for Angie around, this is so much information, and I do agree, going back and watching it again is always a really helpful thing to do. But if everybody can put that bookmarklet on their Google, then the next time you do a Google search, well, you'll know exactly what the university has already got, and then it creates that direct link, and that's the handiest thing that I know.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Super. With that, thank you, Ange, very much for being with us today. I'm going to stop the recording and let everybody go for lunch. Make sure that you all take a break. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. See you.
Bye.
Thank you.